And it's sort of like the work I did in China, strangely enough. I was there doing some regional planning work in China, in a number of coastal provinces of China. It was fascinating. But I'll move to the next slide, please, and it'll be the outline of the presentation. I thought, for some of you, species at risk are probably quite well understood and quite well known. I'll start to talk about it briefly in terms of the introduction, and then I'll move into the broader context, because I know you'd like to hear about what COSSARO does. And what COSSARO does is rooted in global listing and national listing and processes in different places. So when I talk about COSSARO, I'll explain who we are, why we exist, what our mandate is, and then how species are assessed, because the assessment process is an interesting one. And I'll talk about some challenges and opportunities too. I don't know if any of you are, I'm sure Glenn's aware, that the Auditor General released a report just this week. I think it was early in the week. And the Auditor General has assessed the Species at Risk program in Ontario, including some comments on COSSARO. And I thought you might, I honestly haven't had a chance to read it in detail yet because of this mediation, but I scanned through it quickly early this morning, and I have a couple of observations I can offer about the Auditor General's report, and I can offer some concluding remarks and observations. I'm generally pretty familiar with this Muskoka area. Unfortunately, I don't get up there nearly enough, but I know the species and I understand the landscape and the physiography pretty well. And I've had a chance to go back to Ron Reed and Bonnie Berg's my original reports in Muskoka and some of the more recent work around natural heritage. So I've tried to do my best to refresh my memory about Muskoka. But if we go to the next slide, that's what we'll, and the next one too, we'll start talking about species. I hadn't realized there were almost 9 million species on the planet, although I don't know how scientists ever estimate that, but that's apparently the number that we work with, 8.7 million compared to, I guess, almost the same number in billions of humans. We've got about 30,000 species in Ontario, and about 2,700 are species of concern. But we have an Endangered Species Act that was promulgated in 2007, and there are 243 species that are listed under that act, and that's really what COSSARO deals with. The listing of those species, and we've been involved since 2007 and before that in the assessment and listing. There are now 243 species there. The lists that I'll talk about at the global, national, provincial levels have different actions or results on the ground. Some are complete protection in Ontario, for example. Some manage harvest, some ban trade in endangered species, like the CITES, Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. But I'll talk about each of these perspectives, not to get into a lot of detail, but just to give you a sense of what happens at these different levels. Next slide, please. And who am I thanking for changing the slides? Is that you, Glenn?
That's Rebecca.
Rebecca, thank you, Rebecca. The IUCN is sort of the big body globally that decides what's at risk, what's endangered and threatened on the planet. The IUCN, I was fortunate to go to not the most recent IUCN meeting, which was just held in Marseille, France about a month ago or so. I didn't want to risk traveling to Europe, but I got to go to the last one that was in Hawaii. That was a really interesting meeting, but it's fascinating to see all of these people gathered from all over the world to talk about species at risk. And what they use is something called the red list. They also have a green list and a blue list now too, but the red list is really globally what people look at if you want to know what the status of a species is. And the red list is compiled by people all over the world, mostly from governments and non-governmental organizations. And you'll have this to be able to link on and look at afterwards, I think, too. So that'll be an opportunity to get familiar with them. But the next slide, Rebecca, is the sort of the big picture. The global red list it's not like an automatic listing of species like we have in Ontario, which is slightly changed. It's no longer completely automatic. But Ontario, if you have a list, it becomes protected. In the global red list, it's a flag. and some countries pay attention to it, some countries don't. For example, there was a small lizard on a rock in Barbados when I did the National Environmental Plan for Barbados. What a wonderful place to go and work. Not as nice as Muskoka, but Barbados has some nice features. And this lizard is on the red list. It's the only place on the planet the lizard occurs. But in Barbados, it's not protected. So the red list has a purpose. It's not already, it doesn't respond in terms of action on the ground, unfortunately. But out of the 37 species that the IUCN have gone through and listed, 3,600 are in Canada. And there are a lot of very familiar names. You know, snowy owl, COSSARO doesn't deal with, for example, but it's on the red list. So there are species on the red list that we might recognize in COSSARO or have dealt with, but there are many others that we don't. And a lot of the, when you look at the red listed species in Canada, a lot of them are marine, and some of the northern species in particular. But those are just a few of them. And red wolf is, I think, also known as Algonquin wolf in COSSARO language right now. So there are a lot of labels, and with the next slide, Rebecca, I'll talk about some of those labels. You know, and all the labels, IUCN uses slightly different labels than COSEWIC does, which is a federal body that COSSARO does. And then you go to other jurisdictions like the states, and all these words mean different things. But in COSSARO's language, you know, those three that are in the middle there, sort of are the three that we deal with in COSSARO. We call them endangered, threatened, and special concern, but in the IUCN they call them different things. So this is an example of labels and how people in the world have to compare labels and try and understand what does that mean in Ontario or what does that mean in Canada. So the next slide, I'll talk about COSEWIC. COSSARO is Ontario's committee that deals with species at risk. Federally, the committee is called COSEWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And their committee was formalized in 2003, and it follows the federal legislation, which is called the Species at Risk Act, SARA. So in Canada, we have an act that's useful across the country. But what happens here, this is a little more assertive than the IUCN Red List. COSEWIC then recommends that a species should be listed and added to the Species at Risk Act. It's not an automatic listing, and the Minister of Environment, Climate Change, I think it is, has the obligation then to decide whether it gets added to the Act. So federally, it's a little more assertive in terms of making sure some of these get onto the Species at Risk Act. Some don't, but the politicians and the people who are involved in this in government take a moment to assess, are there political, social, or economic factors that might be considered before they automatically add it to a legislative list. So it only applies to species on the list. It applies to federal lands in particular, but those federal obligations also go into water. In Georgian Bay, for example, you know, wherever you get the Department of Fisheries, Oceans involved federally, they can also bring in the Species at Risk Act federally, and there is overlap with what we end up talking about in COSEWIC. So I think the bottom line is they can choose to list or not to list. And then the next slide, Rebecca, is just a yellow slide to turn our attention to COSSARO on the next slide. And COSSARO, it really began as a group of people, and you see some of these people on this slide, this goes back a long time. People like James Kamstra and Justina Ray. These are old timers from the early days of COSSARO. And originally it was a voluntary committee. It was just an advisory committee. It wasn't formalized under legislation because the first Endangered Species Act in Ontario was 1971. And I'll talk about that a little bit further too. But COSSARO got formally established in 2008 under the new legislation, which is called the Endangered Species Act in Ontario. So that was formalized, and anybody that was on the government side of things who were on that committee, some of the specialists provincially, they decided to pull out because COSSARO is an arm's length third-party group of scientists and experts who advise the government, but the government didn't want to be seen as influencing what COSSARO was doing, so the government decided it was more appropriate that third-party arm's length people filled those positions. And the appointments, like Glenn's appointment, my appointment, they're through what's it called, public appointments secretariat, but it's a lieutenant governor order in council that formalizes the membership. So people like Glenn and I potentially have to be standing before a standing committee of the legislature to answer questions about who we are and why we wouldn't pose a problem to the government being on the committee. I didn't go through that process, Glenn. I don't know if they made you go through a standing committee. No, that's good. I think a couple of people have, but the government tries to stay arm's length as much as they can, and I'll talk about the Auditor General report a little bit later too. The next slide shows our current members, except for me because I couldn't fit my name on the screen. But we've got a mix of people, and I was reflecting, and we've got 5 of the current 11 members have their PhDs. So we've got a very skilled group of people, including Glenn, and a diverse group of people. A couple of academics, Guelph and Lakehead. Toby Thorne is one of the bat specialists, bat conservation specialists at the Toronto Zoo. Steve Piero spends his life and his passion dealing with insects. And then the others of us have a mix of practical and scientific experience. The next slide is one of our species at risk, the cougar, but there are discussions about whether it really occurs here. I think it does, mostly in northwestern Ontario, but I'm sure I've heard it on the Bruce Peninsula, and people report seeing it in Niagara and some of the larger systems, but there are escaped cats as well as native puma, so there's some questions about it. COSSARO usually meets twice a year, once in the spring, once in the fall. And we put Glenn through the ringer last year because for about 2 years, the province didn't add people to our committee. So we didn't have enough members to get quorum to be able to vote. So there's a period of time when COSSARO went dormant because we weren't getting the appointments we needed. And we kept raising that with the province and said, we can't fulfill our mandate if you don't appoint members. So last year, I think we had 9 meetings. I think it was in the final count, most of them virtual, but we cleaned up the whole backlog of species that had sat unassessed for 18, 24 months. So it was a very productive year last year. And if you're ever interested in watching a COSSARO meeting, the dates are on the website, and I've got that on another slide here. Observers can come in, they have to sign a confidentiality form that they won't share the content of the discussions, because these are confidential discussions. The votes themselves are completely confidential. Even observers can't see how we vote. So the end result of a COSSARO meeting, and we just had one recently, we've had three meetings this year, or is it 4? Oh my gosh, what a blur. All of the results from all those meetings are going to be in an annual report that has to go to the Minister of MECP, Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, has to go there before the end of January. So that then there's a period of 3 months where the ministry looks at it and eventually the results roll out. But you won't hear the results of meetings of COSSARO for months after the meeting's concluded, and you won't know the outcome of the votes until then either. And the next slide just gets into a little bit more about how we do it. For example, Glenn would pair up with another member and they would assess one species, and Glenn would be a primary author, the secondary author would be there to provide input, review, but it's our job as members to make sure that we have all of the information that's required. And that's not as easy as it might sound, because we rely heavily on the federal government and their COSSARO process to give us what they've done at a national level. We then look at it with a provincial lens. And then, Glenn and the other members would make a presentation at the committee that the observers would listen to, and they'd have an opportunity to see what the discussion is amongst the members and get a sense for where the species might be going in terms of voting, and they get a sense of all of the science. And periodically I'll open up the floor to observers for questions. But they haven't tended to want to ask a lot of questions in the last little while, so that doesn't come up that often. And Rebecca, the next slide is really just telling you that we have 12 members, up to 12 members. Right now we have 11, and the chair doesn't get. I don't get involved in assessing species. It's my job to make sure that we're fulfilling our mandate that the province states in the legislation, and to make sure that people have the right information they need and to manage the process. So I fortunately don't have to get into the details of assessments of species, but I have to produce the annual report and be available if the minister has any questions. We don't have anybody who is Indigenous on our committee, and that's been a challenge for quite a while. I've been trying to do more outreach to First Nations in particular, because I know a few of them quite well. Grand Treaty 3 up in northwestern Ontario was reaching out. They want us, for example, they've asked us to take a look at moose and wild rice. And those are things that the COSSARO is thinking about and we're wondering about for 2022. And those two species obviously are important in Muskoka, and you might have some questions about that. The membership requirements, it used to be just sort of a scientific basis that people had to bring forward one of these scientific disciplines. More recently, as the legislation was amended, there was always, and I don't use Aboriginal traditional knowledge, I use Indigenous, I try to pick language that isn't disrespectful, but the legislation uses Aboriginal traditional knowledge. Community knowledge has been given more prominence now in the recent changes in the legislation. So we have to look at the science, community knowledge, whether that's Ontario Nature or Ontario Fur Managers Federation, or any group that has knowledge about how a species might be behaving and in what numbers on the landscape. So that's what it takes to be a member. And our mandate on the next slide, Rebecca, our mandate is, sorry, my iPad just fell over. We're responsible for the criteria for assessing species, and we keep a list of the species that we need to pay attention to. And there's something some of you might have heard of, the Natural Heritage Information Center based in Peterborough. They're sort of the keepers of the natural knowledge in Ontario. But we assess, review, and classify species, and I'll talk a little bit more about how those species are selected, but we submit an annual report to the minister, and we provide advice to the minister. The minister hasn't asked for advice of COSSARO, I don't think, on anything in the years I've been involved. We're pretty much left on our own to do what we think is necessary. Then the minister appreciates getting the annual report, which I describe on the next slide. So we submit that report, and it's funny. Last fall, I had this feeling we needed to do a more comprehensive report, because the reports in previous years were not that detailed. Most of the details were kept in our minutes for meetings, but I put more effort in, and all of the committee contributed to a much more fulsome annual report, and you can find that posted on the Environmental Registry of Ontario, so you can actually get a copy if you want. But the report includes a list of the species assessed and a summary of the assessments. And then last year, we also included quite a bit of information about, we were well behind on assessments, we didn't have enough members, we needed to be able to get our membership back, here's the progress we've made. And we have the opportunity to assess species, but we didn't to reassess species. We really haven't done that much, which I think we should be doing, and that's one of the things I'll talk about in the end. But I think our more detailed annual report was helpful, because immediately after we issued that, the Auditor General decided to audit the program. So we were able to give the Auditor General a fairly comprehensive picture of what had happened over the last year. So I think that was helpful. So if we go to the next slide, I'll go back in history a little bit. And if I'm trying to keep an eye on the time too, I don't want to go on too long. So if you find you want me to speed up or skip some slides, just let me know. This is interesting. Blue racer at the bottom right is an interesting snake. But I did some work on Pelee Island years ago, and we were working for the quarry operator, Pelee Island Quarries at the time, and they were trying to do some expansion and approvals for expansion. And the blue racers, which are quite unusual, they're a constrictor species. They were laying their eggs under scraps of metal in this quarry floor, and we couldn't touch it. The eggs were cooking under the metal, and the population wasn't growing, but in part because the eggs were getting fried. But the old act didn't allow enough flexibility to even deal with a situation like that. So it had some challenges. So the legislation was updated. And I'll talk in the next slide about what changed in the legislation, because in 2019, in the next slide, Rebecca, please. So I talked about the report needing to get done more quickly, because sometimes the report would sit for months before it got finalized. So the ministry absolutely was correct, and the minister was correct to accelerate that. The minister now, instead of an automatic listing of a species under the Endangered Species Act, the minister could choose to suspend a species habitat protection for up to 3 years to address social and economic impacts. And a lot of people see that as a weakening of the protection of species. What it does is it moves more towards what the federal government does. So it used to be automatic listing. There would be no opportunity for delay. That's changed. Now, we issued our last report, and there was I don't believe there was any suspension of species, or we haven't received a request from the minister to reassess any species either. So far, the implication of that hasn't been really noticed. But the next piece, this is the only change that really affected COSSARO. The condition of the species across what they affectionately call the broader biologically relevant geographic range that we have trouble saying in each meeting multiple times, both inside and outside of Ontario. That's new. That came in 2019, and that changed how COSSARO needed to, the criteria we needed to assess species. So in the next slide, I talk a little bit about that BBRGR, which we shorten in our meetings usually to BBRR, because it's really hard to deal with that. But what it does, and COSSARO we had to collectively figure out, what does that mean in the legislation? We were told by the province that they wanted to make sure they were focusing the resources, provincial resources, where it was most important. So they said, you need to look outside of Ontario, consider that. So we translated that into, we need to look at where this larger context is. What is the range of a species? Are there independent populations? Is there a relationship between a population and the physiography, or things called faunal zones or ecoregions? So COSSARO had to pretty much decide how we would do that. And then the condition posed a whole different aspect. And it's funny how you can take a word out of a piece of legislation and spend hours trying to understand what it means. But the points there are the kinds of things that Glenn and I talk about in our meetings when we're talking about, so what is the BBRR and condition for this species that we're dealing with now? So that gives you a sense of what changed. And one of the biggest challenges we have is, so what is the status in other jurisdictions? And the next slide gives you an example. This is a gray fox, and you can see, picking just a few of the jurisdictions, the status levels vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And we don't always know what they mean in their jurisdictions as apparently secure. Is that the same as our apparently secure, or is it special concern? Is it not at risk? So that's one of the challenges I'll conclude the presentation with, because that's one of the things that COSSARO is working with and trying to find our way through. And the next slide just gives you, this is sort of, these are the pieces on our website. It's our website that the province created for us. I think somebody tied up COSSARO.ca years ago, and the government could never get access to it, so they created COSSAROagency.ca. So if you go to COSSAROagency.ca, you'll be able to find out more about some of the things that I'm talking about. And the next piece, next section, after that slide, the next section we'll talk about is the status. So if we go to the next slide, it's how are they assessed there are some basic questions we ask ourselves, and these are 4 questions we ask. Is it taxonomically distinct? Is it a species? Is it a subspecies? Is it a hybrid? Is it a variety? Is it truly taxonomically distinct? Are there designatable units, which means are there populations that are different enough that you could call it a distinct unit? And we call them DUs, not Ducks Unlimited, but designatable units. Is it native to Ontario? Is the occurrence known? Do we actually know where the species occurs in Ontario? And just to give you an example, the next slide is not in the Muskoka area, Lake Erie water snake. That's a snake that I, as an ecologist, I should love all snakes, but some of them freak me out a little bit. When I did work on Pelee Island, this water snake is huge. And what it would do is it would be near the shoreline and it would anchor its tail in the rocks on the shoreline, and it would rise up out of the water and it would be swaying in the shallow water. And they'd be coming up 2 or 3 at a time, swaying, looking at you. It was really strange. But in this case, yes, it is taxonomically distinct. There's no designatable unit. The whole population is the same, essentially. Extant means it's still there, and it is eligible for assessment. So those are the questions we go through. And then the next slide gives us a sense of the criteria. There are 5 criteria we use as COSSARO. These are criteria that help us decide, is it threatened or is it endangered? Does it meet any of these kinds of criteria? And there's a whole qualitative process that goes behind each of these. And each member of the committee has to walk through these in their presentations and explain why a species does or doesn't meet each of these and which specific criteria under these they meet. And it gets complicated, but that's how those are the criteria we use. And then the next slide shows 2 other pieces that we refer to sometimes, status modifiers. What's Ontario's responsibility for species? Do we have 3% of the range of the species in North America? And if so, then our responsibility as a province is relatively low. Or is it 70%? And the rescue effect is interesting for species that are more mobile, not necessarily salamanders and some of the reptiles and amphibians, but like gray fox or other large, medium-sized mammals, some reptiles that are in sort of the archipelago of islands in Lake Erie. How mobile are they? And if the population decreases in Ontario, can it be rescued with individuals from outside of Ontario is what that means. And then the next slide is really just in terms of this species, we ended up deciding of special concern. That was the end result of this process. And we decided the rescue effect is quite possible. The Nature Conservancy of Canada owns quite a bit of land in this archipelago of islands in Western Lake Erie that really stretches from the US to Canada, and there's an opportunity for the movement of these snakes back and forth. So the rescue effect is quite possible, and we do have a fair sized population, so our responsibility is significant for that species. And I'll just spend 2 slides on classification. And there's you may know Corey Carveth. She was or is with the province in the biodiversity group. She was kind enough to give me a number of very pretty slides that I continue to use and source from her, because she's done a nice job on them. But this is the gradient of what COSSARO can end up with. Endangered is at the top end in terms of the small population declining trends. It's really important we pay attention to it. Threatened is the next step down. Special concern. The legislation doesn't apply to special concern, but the province is supposed to prepare management plans for those species, even at special concern, so they never get to threatened. Extirpated and extinct, fortunately, we don't deal with very often because all the species we're dealing with are still here. Data deficient, sometimes if we have a lichen that's only been reported in one location in Ontario and we don't know if it's elsewhere and we don't know if that 1920s record is real, we might be data deficient. Or if we know this populations are substantial, not declining, they might be not at risk. And then just the final slide on this section just explains the extinct and extirpated and data deficient in a bit more detail. But I think I'll skip that because I've talked about it, and we'll go to the yellow slide. and then to the examples after this, because these are the challenges and opportunities. I have 3 slides here, and then I think 1 or 2 on conclusions. Just to give you a sense of some of the challenges we've encountered, American bumblebee was assessed a year or more ago. And there's a lot of community knowledge out there. People see bumblebees and recognize them, and there's a real importance attached to having as many people out there identifying locations where they know enough about the species to give a valid identification. But even with a species that's that commonly known, there still was a relative absence of the best available information to be able to assess the species. We did do it with as much information as we could get, but sometimes we just don't get enough information, and insects are a pretty common challenge for COSSARO. Ringed seal was interesting because, and it brings in the indigenous piece. Ringed seal is up in James Bay, Hudson Bay, and up into the Arctic. And the James Bay population uses, I think it's called a Kimsky Island, which is about 14 kilometers offshore Ontario. And it's even though it's that close to Ontario, the jurisdictional boundary between Nunavut and Ontario pushes that island into Nunavut, although it's really right beside Ontario. And we know then, we try to find out, so from an indigenous perspective, did people traditionally hunt ringed seal in Ontario? Did the seal ever make it to the mainland? Was it only ever offshore? Well, what about polar bears that eat ringed seals? They're in Ontario. So we had to go through quite a bit of dialogue trying to understand not just the range, but the range jurisdictionally, the range traditionally, the range from an indigenous perspective. So those are the kinds of questions that can really be challenging, especially on the indigenous piece. There, we don't do as thorough a job trying to make sure that First Nations and Métis nations in Ontario know what we're doing. And so part of my job as a chair, and one of my goals in 2022, is to make presentations to as many First Nations and Métis nations as we can next year, to begin to more begin to more regularly share knowledge, because we think we're missing an important aspect there that's called for in the legislation, but we really don't have the resources and the time to do it properly. And the government depends on a 650-person mailing list to alert people of the work we're doing. That's one of the challenges. The next slide is some questions, and the one after that's opportunities. But how do we improve? And these are discussions we have at COSSARO all the time, and with the province. And resources, again, are limited, and that's one of the things the Auditor General pointed out, that there probably aren't enough resources put into the whole species at risk program to achieve what we're trying to achieve. But how do we improve the scientific information that we're collecting and gathering? How do we access the science information out of Ontario? Right now, COSSARO members are supposed to pick up the phone and call adjacent jurisdictions and ask. We're not a government body, we're an arm's length committee, so we're in discussions with the province about, it should really be government to government. How can we make that happen more smoothly? And then how do we compare standards? One of our, used to be MNRF, now it's a longer acronym, but one of the Natural Heritage Information Centers, provincial staff, has a pretty good handle on jurisdictions across Canada, but even COSEWIC doesn't think about, well, what's going on south of the border, what's going on in Russia for some of the marine species. So we're sort of in new ground trying to figure out how do we compare standards across these jurisdictions. And I've mentioned, are we doing enough in terms of Indigenous knowledge? The opportunities piece is, I think, interesting. And, people talk about citizen science. And I was reading a paper where some people were saying, we probably shouldn't use citizen because that's a commonly used phrase, because I think there was some suggestion that it might be alienating people who actually aren't citizens, who are in our societies but don't hold citizenship. So I don't know what we call them, but how do we more meaningfully engage people in communities like in Muskoka? Now, I consider Muskoka, from the little bit I know about the district and the Watershed Council and some people I know who do their own ecology up there. There's a wealth of knowledge and people in Muskoka who are fully engaged in nature observation and more than that. Are there some things we can do to further inspire and encourage more of that to happen? And I'm sure you're dealing with that sort of thing through your integrated watershed planning and management. Are there more opportunities for local innovations? You know, there are underpasses on roads, for example, a lot of culverts. There aren't that many open-topped culverts with the grates that they have in Kildare throughout Muskoka or throughout other portions of southern Ontario and central Ontario. So is there something municipalities could be doing differently about underpasses? Are there funding sources available to pick sort of the critical hotspots and do something different? And you may be doing that now. I apologize if I don't have a clear picture of that. And the Auditor General, you know, there were comments, again, I scanned it quickly, but some of the comments, if you take a look at it, I think the Auditor General was concerned about transparency around, you know, who's appointed to COSSARO, who's appointed to SARPAC, how do appointments happen? There was concern about does COSSARO have enough resources to be able to make sure they have all of the information they need to do thorough assessments of species? So there are a couple of sort of concerns like that related to the committees, but there are broader concerns raised in the Auditor General report about, does the government have enough resources, and are they putting enough resources into the endangered species program or the species at risk program to be able to do things like recover species? You know, we've got lots of recovery plans, we've got government response statements. Is the action on the ground keeping up with these? And are we keeping up with the species that need to be listed? Like, one of our initiatives in COSSARO right now is, let's take a look at some of the species that aren't just done by COSEWIC that we look at from an Ontario lens. What are the species in Ontario that we need to look more closely at that COSEWIC's not looking at? And we've got a list internally, a working list of 20 or so species that COSSARO thinks are important enough that we need to spend some resources on. So we're in the process of finding those resources so that people can get out there and do status assessment reports for them, so COSSARO could then look at them. In Muskoka, like your wealth of reptiles, not to mention your landscape diversity and the opportunities you have that you've already taken advantage to make sure you're protecting the important natural areas. You're in quite a unique place with sort of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence or the Mixed Wood Plains coming into the Boreal. You're in a transition zone from the shore of Georgian Bay back into Algonquin territory. You're in sort of a transitional place where you've got a significant diversity of species. So beyond things like underpasses, how much encouragement can we give people to help recover other species, whether it's bat boxes or barn swallow structures, or, you know, nesting sites for snakes, hibernacula. There's a lot of those sorts of things. And I've mentioned the Auditor General, so I'll go to the concluding remarks, and I only have one slide left. The next slide is really brief concluding remarks, because I could talk for hours, and I've probably talked too long already. So this last slide, and I'll just see if there are any questions. But what I've learned is that species assessments are going on all around the world, starting at the IUCN globally, going to COSEWIC, going to COSSARO. The states have their own processes, but the impacts of those lists vary. And Ontario has one of the more stringent implications of species getting listed, although that has been adjusted slightly in the 2019 amendments to the legislation. It's still a very rigorous piece of legislation, in my opinion. We need to do a much better job of blending Indigenous and Western information and knowledge. And I personally have a passion about that. I've done a lot of thinking and work around that. How do we share knowledge respectfully and recognize that there are really two different kinds of knowledge, or at least that we're dealing with, and how do we share that wisdom? That's an area I think there are significant opportunities. And I finish with your council, which is a very sophisticated group of people and a sophisticated membership. Are there things, I'm sure there are things you're already doing, help excite you about, or maybe you have some species you think COSSARO should be assessing. Maybe there are some particular declines in the Muskoka area and beyond that you're seeing that you have some concerns about. Those are the kinds of things that you can ask for help on. And it would go through the province and get to COSSARO, and we'd have a chance to talk about it. But I thought I'll leave it there, and I hope that was helpful, and hope it's not too much information, but I'll stop there. And the next slide is just thank you.